in the chaos. That'll be good. Does anyone have any questions to start off, or do you guys want to start off with that question?
I'll start out with doorway. I think we are imposing a conceptual scheme on at least ayahuasca when we talk about it taking you someplace else. I don't think ayahuasca takes you someplace else. I think it takes you right here. I think that right now, this room is filled with spirits. Right now, on the walls of this room, there are brilliant tessellated tiles of bright colors. Right now, there are streams of bright blue water running through this room. Right now, this room is filled with the singing of the plants, which is puro sonido, which is pure sound. And what ayahuasca does, and I think that the mestizos and indigenous people who talk about ayahuasca talk about it in just this way, that it lets you see what is there. It doesn't take you someplace else. And so I think that right now we are in Buddha's Pure Land. Right now we are in the magical forest. Right now we are in the land of myth and dream and fairy tale. Right now we are in Sukhavati, and we just don't see it. And I think that when we think about ayahuasca as a doorway to someplace else, we are misrepresenting the indigenous and mestizo perception of ayahuasca and other sacred plants as revealing what is here all along.
Two quick comments, if I might. This is the Stephen part of the spectrum here. So I sometimes, when people ask me if I have a religious affiliation, I say that I'm a lapsed Unitarian, to which one said, not very far to fall. So that's sort of, I was in a Unitarian church, or so it seemed, in Oregon, where Jimmy Punsok, one of the Teardrop Sodial incarnations, who had a bunch of visionary revelations of Wu Chai Shagryotse, Manjushri, etc. And was a teacher of the Holy Dalai Lama, doing cancer, etc. And there's a video someplace where he did this. He was from Goa, and his mala was sort of hung askew on his ear, and he was very fun. I don't know, anybody here ever have the great honor to see Jimmy Punsok? No? Okay. Oh, nice. Well, he turned, or helped us realize, however you want to put it, that Unitarian church into the Pure Land. And so afterwards, sort of outtake interviews, People Magazine and E and all of that stuff. They said, so like, how was that? I said, well, it's good news and bad news. The good news is that Unitarian church is the bliss-saturated realm, just as it is. That's also the bad news. Right? It's like, here we are. Okay, that's one funny comment. The other one is, in some sense, what you said couldn't possibly be true. I mean, as a statement about the actual lived experience, ontological, epistemological, yeah, of course, true. That's the right view and all of that. But surely there's an experiential difference between whether it's ayahuasca induced or not, and then the follow-up becomes between being in direct communication with the vocal, visual, energetic interaction and message exchange with the spirit and the being of ayahuasca and the beings there, and when one isn't. And when you said this is Pure Land, or what it is, that, are you saying that at a certain point when one has been initiated into these traditions, then one more or less has unlimited access to tuning in to dialogic continuation, no matter where one is, or is there an ebb and flow and there are certain sacred spaces within which this is more potentiated?
Vajrasattva in the supermarket.
So, but, and that was a case.
Isn't that what you were doing?
Yeah. But that was, you know, I don't have that experience every day.
Well,
Now.
you got to work at it.
Exactly. No, but
Let's stop looking at it.
yeah.
Or stop working at it, yes.
And so, not that any of us are representatives of, or have been appointed to talk to the, you know, the Galachos. But would you say that those that you've, and if it's appropriate to say, those that you've studied with and apprenticed and your teachers down there would say that at a certain point you'll see that whenever you want, you can get, you know.
I asked one of my teachers specifically, I said, do you see the spirits all the time? And he said, this was so wonderful. He said, I see them all the time vaguely. When I drink ayahuasca, it's like putting on glasses.
What about dialogue? And you know, our mutual friend George Quasha is very interested in what he calls axial language, liminal spaces, sort of the intersection of open-endedness and radiance. Do you feel that you can have the same kind of potent dialogic agency exchange?
Absolutely.
Cool.
Let me take a step back.
Does Susanna have something to say? It looked like you were interested in saying something, Susanna?
Well, let me just finish this
let
thing.
him finish.
Yeah, and then-
Yeah.
Has anybody here ever been in a talking circle? Talking circle, for those who have not, talking circles are miraculous, and they're really very simple. There is a talking stick, and whoever holds the stick gets to speak, and everybody else listens. And it's simple to describe and really, really hard to do, because in our culture we have been systematically taught not to listen to each other. But if you sit in circle with other people, and you are able to speak honestly from your heart, and you are able to listen devoutly with your heart to what other people are saying, you are able to create what St. Francis called a transformed and undefended heart. And that experience of being in a talking circle when it works, when you've had when you've been in a talking circle that is open-hearted and profound, then you are able, I think, to generalize that experience to everything and to everybody. And that when you talk about compassion, when you talk about the ways in which the Bodhisattva is supposed to relate to everybody and everything, that I think is the kind of thing we're talking about. So if you are able to open your heart, the world is filled with persons. There are human persons and other than human persons. There are animals and plants and trees and stones and stars and thunder. And these are all persons, and the idea is that you pass your talking stick to every person you meet. And you hand your talking stick to your friends and your family. You pass your talking stick to the taxi driver, to the person who's packing your bag at the checkout counter at the supermarket. You pass your stick to the tree and listen devoutly with your heart to the tree. And many indigenous people in North America are able to define who is a person and who is not by whether you are able to enter into a mutual gift-giving relationship with that. So you offer tobacco to a rock, and in return the rock gives you a dream or gives you a song, gives you a ceremony. And that means that you are in a dialogic relationship with that rock person. And I think that the goal is, I think what the spirits want, is for us to pass our stick to everybody and to speak honestly from our hearts and listen devoutly with our hearts. And I think that's how we relate to the spirits, and that's how the spirits want us to relate to each other. So yes, in this very life, in this room, in the magic forest, in the land of myth and dream and fairy tale, where anything can happen, that's how we relate to everything around us, I think.
Just wanted to add something from my experience. In that regard, like the talking stick also comes from earthbound traditions, right? Mm-hmm. It's done there, where also the relationship with the otherness is very important. There is something that I have seen though, which is many of us really need to be listened to.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And we're not listened to because we're so full of things to say. When you work with ayahuasca, the most transformational experiences I have seen working with addicts and other people are those where the person feels seen to the bottom of themselves in a place they have never been seen before by another being. Right? So I remember a friend of mine going through a Buddhist retreat in England, telling me that she went to the Lama that was running that, and she asked, how can I serve? Tell me what to do. And he said, listen. I want to say that for me, and what I have seen throughout these years, is the work with the plants down there, but also here, among natives, has to do with intimacy in the relationships. And the relationships evolve in intimacy. They are not just said just because one day I was seen or I saw. It's that cultivation that makes the difference between a good curandero and not a good curandero. Just to say something.
Well, I've just got something kind of trivial and academic to add here. It may come as a surprise to many people, but I believe there's evidence for an Indian equivalent of ayahuasca, and this is connected with the cult of Tara and Vajrakila. That it was based on Acacia catechu, known as Kadira. Kadira Vani Tara is the Tara of the Acacia Grove. She has so many parallels to Ishtar, who was also worshipped in Acacia Groves, who's also associated with the planet Venus, who is also named the star. Buddhists have a different interpretation of Tara. They say it doesn't mean the star, it means the deliveress. But the primary meaning of Tara in Sanskrit is star. And she is also said to be associated with the deity Vajrakila, who is Dorje Prabhu in Tibetan. He has a three-sided point, very much like the thorns on acacias. In fact, there is an English Lama, Martin Board, whose doctoral thesis is about this. He's written a couple of books about Vajrakilaya, but it's only in his thesis that he puts forward the notion that Vajrakila originated as an acacia thorn, and he cites an old text associated with Tara, in which the practitioner of a fire ritual is enjoined to take a handful of keelers and throw them on the fire, and they'll go crackle, crackle, crackle. This doesn't sound like the kind of like iron, brass, whatever, metallic keelers that they have nowadays, but it does sound like acacia thorns. Acacia, in case you were wondering, many species of acacia contain DMT. And DMT, as is well known, is not orally active, but Kadira Vanitara always has two attendants. She also carries two lotuses. So I think it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that this is evidence of a binary entheogen or psychedelic. Or I don't think we have a good word for these substances yet, but so I think one of the ways of taking ayahuasca, people were asking, well, what is the Western way of doing it? One of them might be to rewrite, to update some initiation ceremonies and Ghana chakra ceremonies, the tantric feast, where instead of using, colored water for the amrita, you actually use ayahuasca.
A question in the back here. Tiny, I'm going to try something. If you were talking about the talking stick and everybody's voice coming in and the intimacy that can get created from everybody's voice coming into the circle, and if we take just as an assumption that the whole world is a medicine and there was a Chinese sage and I forgot his
Could you
name.
be just a little louder,
Yeah,
please?
better. There's a Chinese sage that said the whole world is medicine, and I forget which one it was, but I'll talk to Steve afterwards and get the name together. But the thing is, if when you were talking about the disease model now, you were saying one of the important shifts that I remembered was from the individual disease to the collective. If we could shift that somehow, and I'm wondering if we get out of this individualism thing, what does it look like to deconstruct this cultural myth that we have, and jump off into creating a collective one that's going to work rather than once we do the individual one, if we get our voices in. Because I think that's the level, from my experience when I did the medicine work for a number of years, it was the collective experience that we brought back and the reinforcing stories that we were able to tell where we were in the medicine space together. Not just doing our psychobiology or my ancestral or my connection with the spiritual dimension, but actually as a collective group that is experiencing the medicine in that moment together, and there was something to come back and report as you would when the shaman returns from the journey, they're reporting back to the community. There's something that we all need to report back, I think, to the larger community about what we experience in these spaces after we do our biographical ancestral work. I'd love to hear, particularly the shift that you touched on, when you were doing your anthropological kind of analysis of a collective, type of consciousness you indicated there. You remember, Steve, Beyer?
So I'll be Stephen, he's Steve.
That-
So it was your
yeah.
presentation on the social dimension.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the question is.
The question is, can you describe from when you said about the individual healing, that the disease is in the person, right?
Right.
Well, if the disease is in the culture, what does it look like? What is our collective disease of being
It
asleep?
looks mostly like darts.
Darts. But that's one.
And
that's
it
one
depends. The term which is usually used for the physical presence of the disease in the patient's body is generally virote, which is the Spanish term for a crossbow bolt. And when the conquistadores saw the use of blowguns by Amazonian indigenous people, they used the term for a crossbow bolt, and that is the term that is now used as a general term for the darts that were used in blowgun hunting and are used by sorcerers to inflict disease in people. Although, and they are kept in a sticky, slimy, corrosive substance which is in the chest or belly of the shaman and the sorcerer. And the sorcerers' birotes are not just like darts, but they look like scorpions and piranha teeth and razor blades. And drinking ayahuasca allows the healing shaman to see where these darts are located and to suck them out. And so on that level, what you see is that somebody has felt such envy, anger, and resentment because of the behavior of the afflicted person that he has engaged a sorcerer to project these pathogenic projectiles into the body of the suffering patient. And in the process of sucking these out and disposing of them or sending them back to the sorcerer who sent them, there is a process of social healing going on. As one Peruvian poet said, every sickness is an indictment of a breach of confianza, of a relationship of generosity and mutuality. Let me put it this way. We have what are called sickness, what we can call sickness stories. When we get sick, we create a narrative about how it happened. I went into the office and this guy in the cubicle next to me was coughing and sneezing, and now my head hurts and I don't feel well, so I must have caught it from him, and now I've got to stay home, or if it doesn't get better in a few days, I've got to go see the healer, the doctor. And that's our sickness story. Among mestizos and among many indigenous people in the Amazon, the sickness story is this: who have I offended? What have I done? What behavior have I done that has caused somebody to be resentful or envious of me? What breach of confianza, generosity, or mutuality did I do that now I am sick? Somebody came to me to borrow my canoe, and I said no. I had a pump, and somebody asked me if I could borrow it, and I said no. I run a restaurant, and somebody asked me for a free beer, and I said no. It is sometimes it's not even something I deserved. Ex-spouses are frequently the reason why people get inflicted with darts. Not unknown in our own culture. But that's how it works. And every disease is an indictment and requires, like in a 12-step program, a searching inventory of whom you have offended. And part of it is then you've got to make it right. And it manifests itself in your body as these darts of envy and resentment and anger that have entered your body and need to be sucked out by the healing mouth of the shaman. So as far as I understand your question, that's the best I can do.
Thank you.
If I'd like to add a little comment there, that I find this idea of darts very interesting, because in Europe, or at least in Wales, where I'm from, there is the notion of darts thrown by the little people, the good folk, the folk of the forest. There's a word beginning with F, which I was brought up not to use because apparently they don't like it, but we call them the Tolwesteg, the family from the forest, and they can cause disease by throwing darts at you, and they can also cause all kinds of strife, and even hair tangles, which are called elf locks, which are supposed to be caused by elves throwing darts at you, and you didn't notice.
And in Wales, corgis are the what the F people ride.
Oh, I hadn't heard that one. I hadn't
But
heard
I
that.
had the next question. Are you guys still answering this question? Okay.
Among the Yaga and indigenous people of the upper Amazon, when a shaman, one of the constant problems you have when you suck a dart out of somebody is what you do with it. Because you can't just throw it on the ground, somebody might step on it. One way of dealing with it is sending it back to the person who sent it. Among the Yaga, what a shaman will do when he sucks out the pathogenic projectile is he throws it toward the sun, and then it falls underneath the earth where live the people without an anus. And it hurts the people without an anus who live underground. So what they do is they take clods of earth and throw it up where the children of the Yaga eat them and get sick. But this is a very important point, because part of the tragic cosmovision of the Upper Amazon is this. For many Amazonian peoples, you cannot make one person better without making another person sick. And there is no bright line between healing and killing, between being a healer and a sorcerer, between life and death, between predator and prey. They are all in this cycle that are all mixed up together.
I would like to add something to that. That's called The Politics of Retribution by some authors too, anthropologists, Paulo and somebody else I forgot right now. That is true in the way that things dealt were in indigenous ways before. But I would say something there. The influence of Christianity has had like many, what is the harmful and the benign force, right? It has had like both things depending on where you stand, right? And one of the things has to do also with not sending back the darts, and that's part of the practice that I have heard from many curanderos down there nowadays, just out of compassion. And I also want to say that it's like, just to complement what you were saying, like larger, in my experience, like every time I go down there, I see locals, right? Like I see locals in psychotherapy. And it's very difficult to do psychotherapy in the terms that we do psychotherapy here, because the self-reflection, like the introspection, doesn't occur as it occurs with us. The self, this is the best that I can tell, is kind of constructed by the how the others see me as well. So it's a collective self, to say it in some ways, that expresses a little bit what you were talking about. So when you are talking about who you are, what is the image of yourself, it's impossible to separate that from what the others think of you. So the way that you deal with therapy is very different, because it has to do also with your relationships with the others. Primarily, it's about the relational aspect. And I also wanted to add another thing, which sickness is not only because of darts, right? We have different things. We have malaire, for example. We have susto. It has also to do with certain spiritual things that happen without us knowing. For example, a child can get a malaire, right? Because there was a bad wind that had an energetic strength that just crossed him when he was right there, and then he got sick because of that. Then a child can get susto because they saw a spirit, a dead spirit. For example, the tunchi. Tunchi is also called a bird.
Yes,
there is a tunchi bird.
They whistle. They make whistling sounds.
So it's true that there is some, I just want to expand that thing. And also say that many people who I have seen who say, there's daño that's done to me, really don't reflect about what's the offense that they gave. Primarily, it's like, why is he doing that to me? And I think that's a more compassionate approach, the one that you're giving, than what I have actually seen in therapy.
If I might, coming back to Howie's point about the social dimension, the communitarian, for over 20 years, I think he's retired now, professor of public health at UC Berkeley, Leonard started, I think it's DUHL, started a program called Healthy Cities. And his model, I mean, it wasn't invented ex nihilo, building on other things, is that it's very important for those who are looking at the epidemiological aspects of disease to take a look at the surround, the social and economic and political surround. And he focused not on rural, but on urban and the cities. That's one point. Second point, anybody here working on anybody here in MFT? Yeah. So you know there's been a sea change, to use a strange term, in California in terms of licensing in the BBS, that it's now required for the MA to have many more courses that are not so individually focused on therapy, but to increasingly take a look at the social and economic and political dimensions of mental unwell-being. And this is occurring now. And the last thing I want to say from the sort of Buddhist traditions is, and I think responsive to what Steve was saying about acknowledgement. In this Vajrasattva business that I mentioned before, you imagine that this is a practice to acknowledge conscious and unconscious offenses and to pay back. And the way it's paid back to what are called your karmic creditors is to feed them. And what you feed them is all the unacknowledged obscurations which reside in your body and mind and soul. And although you're not supposed to visualize and focus on these bits that are going to feed them, you're supposed to focus on filling up with white light, the nectar, the amrita. The descriptions are quite amazing. There's scorpions and snakes, and they exude and they come out of your body and they go down 7 leagues to feed Yama, the Lord of Death, and his minions. And at the end of it, you imagine that all karmic debts have been settled. There's also a practice called chud, cutting, in which the primary demon is that tight awareness, sometimes called ego or self. And you imagine very vividly, we won't go into it, that you are giving the practice, the jinlu, you are giving your body, but this is a constricted karmic body that you are giving to your creditors. And what you imagine is that different classes of beings that you've offended are being fed, and there's a certain syllable that's used. It's said to be the simultaneous arising of wisdom and compassion, pek, or skillful means. And it said that there are certain beings that we've offended who are shy, and other beings who are very avaricious and putting themselves forward. And so this pek is used, this is at least according to certain traditions of Chod that I know, to silence the over-eager minions of those that would claim, that we should pay them now first, and to allow the shy ones to come forth, those subtle offenses. So there's a lot of acknowledgement, and then finally forgiveness, and one does this over and over again. And epidemiological point about practitioners have showed, at least in one tradition, and my source for this was Namkhai Norbu from Derge, when you got really good at practicing dissolving a tight sense of self and feeding your habits of incarnation to your karmic creditors, and I don't know what the orals were like, you know, you get a little red hat, short hat. And these were the folks who in certain parts of Tibet would go into areas where there was an epidemic of cholera, and at least the anecdotal evidence is that they didn't get sick. They would clear out, and because they're, oh, well, who knows what the because is. Yeah. So
well, there's also the practice called Rivo Sangche, in which you burn incense and you go through a list of obstructive forces and demons, what have you, nightmares and what have you, and you say, if for any reason I've stepped on any of your toes, please accept this sincere offering of incense, and you know, I hope that's settled.
just one very last point here. I had the great privilege of working with some Native American, or as I say in Canada, First Nation folks, and some other folks bringing together Vietnam veterans, and this is like 20 years ago, and Afghanskis, which was a Russian term for Russians who were forced to fight in Afghanistan. And when they came back, their form of PTSD or whatever it was then, traditional methods and that ab-reactive thing, there's a whole thing against that, Pietre Levine and somatic experience, you don't want to re-traumatize them. And it wasn't working, so they came to the United States and we did some compassion-based practices in wilderness, where we went into an area where there had been, I don't know, a little bit of strip mining or something, and they planted a tree. But then we did Rio Sancho, and we did Jinsek, and so offerings, which goes all the way back to the Vedic traditions, and this was in July in the Trinity, and about an hour and a half later it started snowing. And the wisdom wizard, who I actually have a picture of Bakatuku Rinpoche who did this, and it was just like, yeah, whatever, you know. So there's a lot of mixing. Yeah. Oh, wait.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
You're all just wonderful. I have kind of a specific question for Susana. When you showed the picture of the practitioners there, and you said, "Here's our overworked crew," I was just wondering how self-care for the healers that are there. Do you do it, and how was that?
Thank you. Well, also over the years, I have been going down. Like that's a big thing. All of us have to engage in plant work constantly, and that's part of the deal. You know, you need to know what the patients are going through, and you need to do your own work in order to really understand what they're going through. And I know that Takiwasi has been accused to not produce research that is written, right? And it's just, you don't stop in a therapeutic community that's as tiny as it is, Takiwasi is, with the resources, human resources that we have, to be able to step in and say, okay, we're going to do research. At that level, you know, I always say to my students, the problem is the language, you know, the barrier, you know, but go and do research there because it's so much needed, and we that are there cannot do it. So normally, like therapists there go through for protection, plant baths, soplas and icaradas as well. Sometimes we get very charged. We accompany people in the ceremonies, you know, and our clients are there and we're drinking too. There are a lot of things happening there. So you also need to go through therapy yourself to differentiate things. And sometimes there are resources for that, and sometimes there are not. So it's challenging. It's really hard work. It's a 24/7 community, therapeutic community, and we deal also with all this load of people from the outside who come wanting to do this plant diet retreats, and we need the monies too, right? So it's such an interesting place to study, to learn, and we need to be seen. You know, if I put myself in the inner circle. So hopefully more people are going to be interested in just going out there. No curandero is going to write articles about what they do and how successful they are. It's the outer eyes that are needed in order to bring that forth. Yeah.
I had a question, and just back to the original entheogens as gods. I wanted just to add this: in the Mazatec tradition of using the sacred mushrooms, they call them little gods, diositos. So when you go to Huautla and you do a ceremony there, velada, they offer them to you and they call them little gods. Now, but the question I have for all of you is, why is ayahuasca now becoming global, and what's going on? I'm sort of on the hot list, and I get reports from Australia, from Finland, from Russia. There are ayahuasca groups and ceremonies all over the planet now. It's truly become an international phenomenon. What is your take on this?
I think we can, with unusual precision, date this, at least, to about 1993. What happened in 1993? It was the publication of Pablo Amaringo's book, Ayahuasca Visions, the iconography of a Peruvian shaman. And this beautiful, beautiful book, I think, had a tremendous impact. Lots of people looked at the pictures in this book and said, wow, I want to do that. And that started, I think, first as a trickle and then as a much larger stream. First of all, people going down to Peru to drink ayahuasca, and bringing back both the ayahuasca as a consumable and as a set of symbolic associations. I think we need to add to that my firm belief that North Americans have very short attention spans. And anybody who has lived as long as I have knows that back in the 50s, Zen Buddhism was going to change the world. And then LSD was going to change the world. And then the age of Aquarius was going to change the world. And then the fifth Pachacuti was going to change the world. And that Tibetan Buddhism was going to change the world. And now ayahuasca is going to change the world. Well, changing the world does not have a real good track record. And I think that the short North American attention span will soon turn to something else that will be revelatory and redemptive and hip and edgy and transgressive. And I'm putting money on Ibogaine. I think that's going to be the next big thing. So if you want to bet on the future, I think that's going to be the next hip, transgressive, edgy, redemptive thing to take. Ibogaine from the iboga plant in the Bwiti cult. And we're already seeing that. We're already seeing people traveling to Central Africa to take it. We're already seeing people bringing iboga ceremonies to this country and making the same claims. about how it is revelatory, redemptive, it cures addiction, it does, I bet you could make parallel columns of ayahuasca and ibogaine, and you would see exactly the same claims being made for each. So I know that there are ayahuasca advocates who say that somehow plant wisdom is spreading and that ayahuasca wants to change the world and that's why we're doing it, but I have to confess that I am, by the time you've lived as long as I have, you've become quite skeptical of claims like that because the world is still in deep trouble.
I don't think you can stop it changing. It changes of its own accord. I don't want to be seen to be in the position of one-upping Steve. And he said 1993. I remember 1989. My roommate's girlfriend was heavily into New Age, and one day she said to me, "Have you heard of this ayahuasca? It sounds like LSD, but more spiritual." And I have no idea what the word spiritual means, generally, and I certainly have no idea what she meant by it. I'm not sure that she did either. But there seems to have been before the trickle, there was this, these occasional droplets of interest in ayahuasca for its supposed, spiritual content. This would impart something spiritual. But where that started, I have no idea. I mean, the early writings on it, like William Burroughs in the Yahe papers, or Yahe letters, I think it was, he had a terrifying experience and really wrote it off as being, something quite nasty. So where it turned around and became the spiritual version of LSD, I don't know, but it happened, I believe, before 1989.
I had 1993, I think.
Yeah.
So,
Anyway.
yeah.
Is that like that here? Right here.
I have a question that comes from Stephen Beyer's comments or talk. It relates to the role of, the individualistic society and the role of community and things like that. And my question isn't specifically for you, Steve. It's for any of you, but it's related to. I'm wondering if any of you have seen groups of people that were an existing group, not a group that came together for a ceremony, but they did something. They did something together other than just their personal growth work or something of that sort. Go together and do ceremony together, and how that affected the group. I think of the Mazatec tradition where they work with mushrooms, where one member of a family can be ill and the whole family will take mushrooms together and spend the day together, and how they would look at it as a transformative process for the whole family. So I'm wondering if any of you have any experience, actually observational experience of groups that have done work together, or even heard secondhand about some of that.
I have not. I would be very interested. I think that's a wonderful question. And I am going to go home and start looking on the net to see what I can find. I think that's a terrific question. I regret that I had no experience like that. But I think that's something really worth looking at. I'm really curious if anybody knows anything about that.
Well, Shipibo people, normally when they have family members that are sick, accompany also the person through the healing process. But not necessarily drink ayahuasca while accompanying the person during the shamanic seance. So this is what I know traditionally that happens, and basically that's it. There are indigenous, the Tucano people, for example, they also do collective ceremonies together, and they are families, they are together, I think probably more indigenous, ways are foster that, right? Vegetalismo is already mestizo, we're already sentient in some way.
Reminding me of the piece of the question that I left out, which is I'm specifically curious about Western or northern or industrialized world groups, because in indigenous society that's very common. That's why I mentioned the Mazatec work.
I've done mushrooms with my family, with my father, my 2 daughters, and their husbands.
Wow, at the same time?
Oh yeah.
Was that?
Will you be my dad?
That's very good.
What was the collective
Yeah, I
impact?
needed a lot higher dose than them. But I don't know why that was.
It's a Welsh tradition.
Yeah. I actually, it's funny you should say that. We actually have an abundance of Psilocybe semilanciata growing on the Welsh hills. In fact, there was a Welsh member of Parliament, a member of the Welsh Parliament, who suggested that these young people who collect the mushrooms on the hillsides and go over to Holland and exchange them for hashish should actually be subsidized by the government, because the mushrooms are a like specifically Welsh resource. That he didn't get anywhere with it, but I mean, at least it was in the Welsh Parliament. So there is a lot of Welsh mushroom taking.
If I might have a quick question of those who are in the tradition of ayahuasca, etc. Let's say someone is in a bad state, spiritual, mental, physical. What do you know, and it's a broad question, what would be, from the viewpoint of traditional healing contexts, indigenous contexts, contraindications to use what might be the normal procedures, including diet and all of that? Are there certain kind of conditions for which sacred plant use would be contraindicated, traditionally speaking? I mean, the only thing I've heard in North America is if one has hypertensive issues, there can be spike in ayahuasca, and maybe you should use something else. But I'm curious about the, yeah.
If there are generally distinctions made between, I'm not sure this is answering your question, between sicknesses that are appropriately dealt with by Western medicine and sicknesses that are appropriately dealt with by shamanic healing, mostly by sucking, but also by sweat baths and other ways of dealing with it, or in a case of susto, calling the soul back, whatever. But there are distinctions that are made between what are often called like natural diseases or God-sent diseases and the kinds of diseases that shamans heal. There is not a great deal of consistency in dividing up sicknesses this way, but for example, accidents. Somebody who is a skilled user of machetes cuts himself with a machete. That's probably somebody has attacked that person. Diseases, cholera, for example, is considered a white person's disease and is dealt with white person's medicine. As a general rule, there are diseases in many indigenous cultures. There is a distinction between herbal healers and shamans. In Shipibo culture, for example, there is a very strong distinction. So often, by the time a patient is taken to a shaman, the indigenous herbal remedies have already been tried and haven't worked. Or they've tried Western medicine and it hasn't worked. And there are certain kinds of diseases which may resemble ordinary diseases, but they come on really fast, and they're accompanied by bad dreams, and they are resistant to Western medicine or traditional herbal medicine. And in those cases, those are the kinds of diseases that shamans are supposed to deal with. So there is this distinction, but there is a lot of variation in who puts what into what category.
So what I have seen, down there we call the people curanderos, right? Curanderos or ayahuasqueros. It depends on their specialty, but normally a curandero is somebody who is a herbalist. So he also handles like plant diets, purgas, ayahuasca ceremonies and other things, and plant baths as well, right? So what I have seen down there is that everybody has a criteria, and they can, for example, the ahosacha, do you remember I was talking about ahosacha before? Is used also for rheumatism. Like there are a lot of plants that are used for physical conditions that they treat. Curanderos treat physical conditions, not just shamanic, I mean natural sicknesses in that way, using your terminology. And then they also deal with spiritual sickness. Sometimes they are together and sometimes they are not, but they can deal with them. And there are certain things that I have seen in the curanderos that I know. For example, this I have heard from one curandero I know very well, like he doesn't treat people who, when you look into their eyes, the light of life is gone, because they know they are not going to be successful. You know the person is ready to go. Then you won't give ayahuasca to people who are too weak or have cardiovascular diseases or have like gastrointestinal problems that are like severe. You won't do that. You would make them participate in the ceremonies, and then you would do the healing, conduct the healing spiritually in the ceremony for the person. So not everybody drinks ayahuasca when one is sick. That's very important. And remember here, the healing is produced. We are the Westerners, right? Like used to have the experiences ourselves. But what the curandero is seeing might be very different to what we are seeing when we are in the same ceremony about our own sickness, right? So what he's doing is really managing his relationships and putting his intention so that you can be healed. There is a healing intention he's putting there. So he's directing. He's the orchestrator there in that way. I have seen, there is a book that my husband wrote many years ago that's called The Jaguar That Roams the Mind. And there is an account there. This is just one of the many stories, right? An account of a client of mine in Chile who had a brain tumor that was, they couldn't do surgery for it. It was placed in a part of the brain where you could not operate it, basically. And she was developing secondary diabetes. Because of that, she came to the center where we were working with our maestro, literally like falling down because the sugar levels were like awful, with terrible headaches, like in another space. And she was there for 3 weeks. She never had one ayahuasca ceremony. She went back. She had a last one, very little, just very little. She went back home and she did all the tests, and the tumor was not there. So she didn't have an experience, a subjective experience. I think that's also important. The healing occurs independently of what do we do. Yeah.
I have 2 questions, although I was told that this is the last question. You were speaking a little bit about some of the ailments that are healed in ayahuasca ceremonies. I was wondering if you've had any experience with one called pulsario. It's been described as a blockage at the top of the stomach that blocks, it's kind of a knot and blocks digestion, and kind of what you saw, what the healing techniques were around that. And then my second question is I know you, unfortunately I missed your talk, but you spoke mostly about the isolation diet, and in some of the communities here, there's the social diet, and if you could have one pearl of wisdom of something that, I don't know if you struggled with, or a big learning lesson or something on that path that you learned, if you could have one pearl to pass on to anybody who might be involved in the social diet here, what would it be?
What is a social diet?
A social dieta is it's usually lasts about 3 months, and it's open and closed in an ayahuasca ceremony, and it's not necessarily dieting ayahuasca, but one of any of the healing or teacher plants. So you build a relationship with that plant during that period of time, and you follow the same dietary guidelines that you would in social isolation, in terms of no sex and all the food that you avoid, no salt. But then it's kind of adapted so that people can be working with the plant spirit and getting to know them as an ally, as a healer, as a teacher, but apply it into a context where it can be done here.
Well, I talked about the different levels also of diet, and you can do also those diets with certain restrictions in Peru. You know, like it depends on the severity of the sickness. What do you have? The diagnosis. Whether you go in isolation if you have a health condition, right? Or whether you do it socially, as you're saying, where you don't need to go there, but you drink your plant and just restrict some food and sexual behavior and stuff like that. It's done there as well, you know. So I think that if you're working with health conditions, that's possible. I don't know, how deep it is if you're pursuing a shamanistic path or an apprenticeship. To be so engaged with social interaction and activity. Like there is a lot of silence sometimes required to just like cleaning yourself from activity that really helps in a diet. It's a synergy of things in that way. But certainly I have seen like people having strong dreams down south, when they do that type of social diets as well. Strong dreams, some teachings, definitely, they come. So it's possible. Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit about
The pulsario?
Yeah.
Well, Rosa Jove, who is a doctor at CIIS, has told me about the pulsario and her experiences with that. I haven't seen it myself directly. What she says is that most often in her practice as a doctor, she sees women having that, and they're usually women who experiencing an empty nest syndrome, like when the kids are already gone, and they start like developing a big belly like that, and then there is something very hard here in the mouth of the stomach that it's hard and it pulsates, and it's kind of like having a baby in some way. So there are certain plans to work with that, and then there's also sadness, according to her, that is important to liberate through purging. It has to do with retaining instead of releasing, according to her. This is as much as I know.
Thank you.
So thank you, everyone. I know there's some more questions, but it's after 7, and out of respect for our speakers, unless they all say we're willing to stick around for some more time. Okay, then out of respect for our speakers, I say thank you very much for coming and for presenting, sharing your wisdom. And thank you, everyone, as well. I look forward to seeing you again February 15th is going to be our next event. So come on back.